So now let's review homework exercise 9, and we've moved into the causal category of interpretation. And your task here is again doing this in multiple choice form. Identify the type or form of argument or fallacy related to cause in each of the following examples. So we'll look at item number 1 here. The student had bloodshot eyes, craved snack foods, emitted a sweet herbal aroma, and failed a short-term memory test. It is clear she was abusing marijuana. So we have a claim she was abusing marijuana. The argument indicator here, it is clear that, based on these pieces of evidence. The evidence here, bloodshot eyes, craving snack foods, etc. These are all signs that we recognize that are related to the use of marijuana. In other words, there would be, in some sense, a symptom that the person has used marijuana. This particular item, then, is an example of a co-existential argument, or what we call the argument from sign. We didn't observe or see the person using marijuana, but we see the results, the signs, the symptoms of that use. Number 2, if we allow the introduction of sex education to the public schools, students will soon experiment with sexual activity. The school nurse will be handing out birth control, and school authorities will be usurping parental authority on all manner of moral issues. To preserve parental rights, we must stop sex education in the schools. And so in this case, we see an instance where the opposition is advanced to the use of sex education in the schools, and it's not because of any evidence that sex education in itself is disadvantageous or not beneficial, but rather it's an argument from consequence that says all of these other things are going to happen. So the question is this argument from consequence warranted or not, or is it an irrational prediction of what will occur? So if we introduce sex education in the schools, is it inevitable that school nurses will be handing out birth control? Is it inevitable then that it would follow that school authorities will usurp parental authority on all manner of moral issues? Now, of course, there are a few school districts around the country where these kinds of things have also happened, but it isn't inevitable. It is an example of what we call the slippery slope fallacy. That is to say, at any point, we could do a rational intervention in this process and say, yes, sex education in schools is important, but none of these other things should also occur, or none of these other things can occur in this particular district, right? And so that's the slippery slope fallacy. Number 3, studies have shown that the test group of 400 Hispanic and Asian adults given the new COVID-19 vaccine not only had fewer instances of the disease with less severity, but also slept better and had fewer common colds than the control group. It seems we finally have the breakthrough we've been waiting for. The government is ready to approve distribution of the vaccine to the general population soon. So in this case, we have obviously medical research, right? We have a sample of 400 patients given the new vaccine, and on the basis of that sample, we've now suggested that there should be a wide distribution to the general population of the vaccine. And what was found in the test group study was that the vaccine reduced the instances of the disease, and those that got it had a less severe case, and they had these other benefits as well. So there's a causal argument here. The vaccine causes fewer instances of the disease or reduces the severity of the disease, and that's found in the sample of the medical study group, but then it's generalized. So we have what we call a causal generalization argument here. So the answer is E, causal generalization. Number 4. The cause of the financial difficulty at the Whittemore Center is clear. Concession prices are way too high. Last night at the women's hockey game, I paid $8.50 for a piece of pizza and a Coke. At these prices, they cannot be selling enough to pay the debt on the arena. If they went back to Snively-era prices, 50 cents for popcorn, remember that? I'm sure the red ink would disappear. Snively, by the way, was the name of the former hockey arena before they built the Whittemore Center in the mid-90s. You can still see the remnants of Snively Arena where Hamel Rec Center is. The outline of the old ice arena is still visible in the exterior construction or architecture of the Hamel Rec Center. So this argument is offering an explanation for the financial difficulty at the Whittemore Center. And it's suggesting that the cause of the difficulty is the high price of concessions, right? But we would have to ask, does this make sense? Is this a warranted explanation? Is it enough to explain the financial difficulty at the Whittemore Center? Or does it seem like there's more to it than that, right? So we could ask, is high concession prices necessary to explain the financial difficulty? Probably not. And is it sufficient? Certainly not, right? And because we know it's not a sufficient explanation, it might be a contributing factor, but it's not by itself the reason why the Whittemore Center would have financial difficulty. So we know it's not a sufficient explanation, and so we would identify this as a single cause fallacy, substituting, in this case, a rather minor condition as the overall cause for the financial difficulty that's being experienced. So single cause fallacy. Since the repairs were done on the heating system in the building, several employees have had to leave work early with flu-like symptoms. I think they had a toxic reaction to chemical fumes emitted from the newly repaired heating system. Now, in this case, we have, and again, attempt at a causal explanation, but the question here is this causal explanation warranted? Did the employees leave work with flu-like symptoms because of the repairs to the heating system or because of a toxic reaction to chemical fumes emitted from the newly repaired heating system? Or did those two things happen in a sequence of time and that the alleged effect is attributed to the alleged cause but in an unwarranted way? So in this case, I think we would identify the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. More than likely, we would, if we surveyed all of the employees in the building, we would find that there were a number of people who remained in the building, who, in other words, who would have allegedly been subject to the same chemical fumes, who did not have to leave work with flu-like symptoms. And there might be people with flu-like symptoms in other buildings in campus, that is, who were not subject to the alleged chemical fumes. And so each of these we would have negative cause cases and negative effects cases, which would undermine the credibility of the causal explanation here. A better explanation would be not that they had a toxic reaction to some chemical fumes, but that they actually had the flu or COVID-19 or some other flu-like illness, and that was the reason why those employees had to leave. One of the key things here is to note it's not all the employees in the building, but several, and the fact that it's several among a group, right, would tell us that there would be obviously then negative effects cases. That is, there would be people who would be in the same building who presumably would have been subject to the same conditions and yet who didn't have the same effect. And that would tell us this is the post hoc ergo propter hoc, or after this, therefore because of this fallacy. Number 6. History will show that the collapse of the Soviet Union was due entirely to the determination of Ronald Reagan to increase American defense spending and pursue the Strategic Defense Initiative. The Soviet economy simply could not compete in the arms race. So here, obviously, we have a causal explanation of sorts, right? But the question is that causal explanation warranted or not? We have a cause offered, that is the determination of President Reagan, leading to an effect, the collapse of the Soviet Union. But notice the wording here, that collapse was due entirely to the determination of Ronald Reagan, which is to suggest that the only cause was President Reagan's determination. Now, does that seem like a warranted explanation or not? If we think about the history of Eastern Europe from the period of World War II to the fall of the Berlin Wall, there's obviously a number of important factors that could explain or would be part of the explanation for why the Soviet Union disintegrated or collapsed. And some of those factors would include, obviously, the geopolitics associated with President Reagan's determination to increase American defense spending, but also there were internal politics in the Soviet Union. There was the election of John Paul II as Pope, the Polish Pope, who returned to Poland and gave support for the Solidarity movement. There were other insurgent nationalist movements in places like Czechoslovakia, which also contributed to the disintegration of the Soviet sphere in Eastern Europe. Certainly President Reagan's efforts helped that, but it's incorrect, I think, to say that it was due entirely to the determination of Ronald Reagan. In other words, this explanation is too simple. It's a single cause fallacy when we should be actually talking about all of the complex causes, plural, that led to this historical development. So a single cause fallacy. Since he accidentally spilled his Leinenkugel's beer in the garden last week, the rose bush has bloomed beautifully. He has decided to use a regular application of Leinenkugel's to improve his chances at the county fair rose competition this year. So in this case, we have the accidental spill of Leinenkugel's beer, one of my favorite Wisconsin beers. We have the accidental spilling of Leinenkugel's and the subsequent rose bush blooming. The question is, did the rose bush bloom because of the beer spilling? And so we would look for things like necessary and sufficient conditions. We would look for things like negative effects cases, negative cause cases, and those tests would tell us that it's very unlikely that the rose bush bloomed because of the spilling of the Leinenkugels. It was an accident of chronology, not a causal connection. So that's the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, which says after this, therefore because of this. Just because the rose bush bloomed after the beer spilled does not mean it bloomed because of the beer. Number 8, permitting you to make up the missed quiz because of the unfortunate death of your great-grandfather would not be practical. Soon, another student will have a sick neighbor. Then it will be a lost cat. And then the next thing you know, I'll be expected to give makeup quizzes just because the weather is bad. So in this instance, we obviously have an examination of a particular request for a makeup quiz and a consideration of potential consequences resulting from allowing that makeup quiz. In this case, the consequences that are observed would be further developments or reasons for giving makeup quizzes, sick neighbor, lost cat, etc. So the question is this a warranted objection? Is this denial of the makeup quiz based on a rational assessment of the potential consequences? And the answer obviously is no. One could very easily give a makeup quiz because of the death of a family member without then having to give makeup quizzes because someone's cat is lost. So this is an example of the slippery slope fallacy. At any point, a professor could say, here's my policy. If you have a family member who died, that entitles you to a makeup quiz, but I don't have to then give you a makeup quiz because you lost your cat. All right, so number 9. Any effort to lower admission standards for UNH will lead to larger classes, a watered-down curriculum, grade inflation, academic atrophy, and social decay. We must stop the decline of the university before it begins. And this phrase here, stop the decline, actually gives us a little bit of a visual clue that this is another instance of the slippery slope fallacy, right? Lowering admission standards, it might lead to one or some of these consequences, but it is not inevitable that all these horrible things are going to happen if you just do the first step. At any point, you could have a rational intervention in the process and say, yes, we can lower admission standards at least temporarily for a time in this way, and if we see some of these negative consequences happening, we could reimpose higher admission standards if we need to. But the slippery slope fallacy doesn't recognize the possibility of that rational intervention. It says all of these negative consequences will happen inevitably, so we must oppose it at the first step. And so that's the slippery slope reasoning, but it is obviously a reasoning mistake. Number 10, the raising of eligibility standards for government food assistance must be opposed, for it will lead directly to increased malnutrition among poor children and increased hunger even for the working poor. Now, this is similar to number 9 and number 8 in that it is a reflection on consequences of a particular policy. In this case, the raising of eligibility standards for government food assistance, right? And why those must be opposed. In this case, they must be opposed because these negative consequences would happen. But in this instance, it seems very clear that this is a fairly rational assessment of the consequences, that if you increase the standards or raise the standards for eligibility for government food assistance, then very clearly more people will be without food. There will be increased hunger, even for the working poor. There may also be increased malnutrition among poor children. There's not an inevitable sequence of events, but these things would happen almost immediately, and they would be negative. And so they become good reasons for opposing an increase in eligibility standards. This is the argument from consequence. Number 11. Studies have shown that the test group of 1,100 Canadian university students served Earl Grey tea before exams scored on average 13 points higher than the control group, who had no beverage within an hour of test taking, and 8 points higher than those who were served coffee. It is clear that students everywhere should partake of a relaxing cup of Earl Grey right before exams. So again, we have two parts to this argument. You look clearly, we have the sample of 1,100 Canadian university students, right? We have an alleged cause, Earl Grey tea consumption, and an alleged effect, right? They scored higher on their exams than the control group. Sorry about that. And so then what if we found that to be true in the sample, we then see down at the bottom, it's clear that students everywhere, the everywhere tells us this has now become a generalization. So we have a causal generalization argument. Now, of course, we might be able to test whether the causal claim is warranted or not. We might be able to also ask whether the sample is representative, but those options aren't given here as the choices available. The best explanation is that this is a causal generalization. Number 12. The cause of the disparity in GPA between men and women on campus is clear. The majority of full-time faculty are male, and like gentlemen, they are less demanding and more forgiving of their female students. As a result, female students get higher grades from male professors. So in this case, the arguer is looking to account for a set of facts. In this case, the puzzling fact is the disparity in GPA between men and women on campus. And the explanation that's offered is that female students get higher grades from male professors. And because most of the professors are male, that explains why women have higher GPAs than men. So obviously this is an attempt at a causal explanation in the sense that we have an attempt to explain a set of facts, and a cause is offered as the hypothesis or explanation. But then the question is that causal explanation warranted or not? We would test that causal explanation first by asking whether the alleged cause is necessary to produce the alleged effect, and then we would ask whether the alleged cause was sufficient to produce the effect. And if we look especially at the necessity test, we find that it's probably not a warranted explanation, in the sense that we could probably find a number of female students who take all or most of their classes from female professors and still get better grades than the men in those classes. We could also find perhaps a number of male students who are doing very well even when they have male professors, right? And so because of that, we would say it's obviously a causal explanation, but it's not warranted because it fails those tests. Now, you might also be looking at, well, isn't it then the post hoc argument or post hoc fallacy? However, if you look at the argument, you'll see there's no reference to a sequence of time or to chronology of any kind, right? And so that wouldn't be the best choice for the indicated fallacy. Rather, it is a false cause fallacy. That is, the cause which is alleged here, in fact, is probably not the best explanation for why women get better grades than men on campus. Number 13, I'm in favor of raising the academic standards for UNH admission, since higher standards will improve the reputation of the university, which in turn will bring more talented faculty and more grant money. So in this case, we have a policy claim. A person takes a position in favor of raising academic standards, and the evidence that's given, and we recognize the evidence because of the argument indicator since. It tells us everything that follows here is evidence. The evidence that's given are all positive advantages or benefits to the university, improving its reputation, bringing more talented faculty, increasing grant money. But notice it's all talked about in the future tense. These things will happen. Standards will improve, will bring about more, or will bring more talented faculty, right? So we're looking forward to the consequences of this policy change. Those consequences are beneficial, so they become reasons in favor of the policy change, and we call that the argument from consequence. Number 14, he disputes even common sense statements, debates with strangers about trivial matters, contradicts conventional wisdom for recreation, and argues with authority for the adrenaline rush. It is clear that he suffers from that rare disease, argumentationum extremis. This is a condition only exacerbated by his acute Guinness deficiency. So in the midst of this pandemic, we've created now a new fictional disease, and we recognize the symptoms of that disease. Obviously, it is fictional, but just the same, if we arrived at that conclusion by considering all of the symptoms, we have an example of a co-existential argument, or the argument from sign. We can't perhaps see the virus or the microbe that causes argumentationum extremis, right? But we can recognize its symptoms in what is described here. So we reason from the sign to the underlying cause, the co-existential argument. And then finally, the visiting professor carried a union card, participated in job actions, and even encouraged her students to read famous pro-labor speeches. It is clear she is a union supporter. Again, we don't know for certain. We're speculating about her status as a union supporter, but we are reasoning to that conclusion or that claim on the basis of observable facts that serve as evidence, right? So all of these facts here, carrying a union card, participating in job actions, encouraging students to read famous pro-labor speeches, these are signs of a person who is a union supporter. So it's another co-existential argument. So that's exercise 9. If you have questions on any of the items here or on any of the fallacies or argument forms that are reviewed, please post your questions on the discussion board.